Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center Washington, and I would like to welcome you to this special webinar today focusing on the UAE-Bahrain normalization with Israel and the Gulf reactions and implications for all parties concerned. As you know, last Thursday, October 15th, the Israeli Knesset overwhelmingly, with actually a vote of what, 84 and 13 against, ratified the UAE-Israel Accord, normalizing diplomatic relations between the two countries. This US brokered deals or series of deals between Bahrain, UAE, and Israel were initially signed in a highly publicized ceremony here in Washington at the White House on September 15. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, in commenting about the approval or the ratification of the Knesset, was quoted saying, and I'm quoting him, "Many Arab and Muslim countries want to get close to us. They see our military and intelligence, technological and economic power. They are changing their attitudes toward us." End of quote. Frankly, the words uttered by Netanyahu did not, although they are maybe over enthusiastic, but they did not fully explain, I believe, the rationale for these accords, the internal and regional reactions they generated, or the future implications and prospects of this new Arab and Muslim readiness to acknowledge and normalize relations with Israel. Most objective analysts throughout the world, including, of course, Arab analysts and Israeli analysts, continue to pursue the myriad of unanswered questions emerging from this series of events over the past few weeks. To help us decipher these issues and deal with some of these questions, we have convened today a virtual panel of 3 internationally recognized experts on the region who will spend the next hour focusing their remarks on the content and regional implications of these normalizations agreements and the potential alliances that might emerge from them. They will each have 15 minutes to give us their own personal analysis of the topic. And then we will spend the balance of our time, about 30 minutes plus, in the art of conversation with you, trying to answer some of your questions. Please use the Q&A format on your Zoom page to send your questions, or otherwise email your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. Please identify yourself and your affiliation if you don't mind, and briefly state your question and to allow us to accommodate as many of you as possible. Let me introduce the speakers, and we will go alphabetically today, and they will speak in that order. We will begin with Abdullah Baabood, who is visiting professor at Waseda University, Research Intensive Institution in Tokyo, Japan. He is in Oman today. Prior to that, Abdullah served as visiting professor at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore in US. And Dr. Baabood has written extensively on Gulf-related topics throughout his career, including Gulf countries and Arab transitions, Qatar resilience strategy and implication for state-society relations, and the dynamics and determinants of GCC foreign policy. Our next speaker would be Cinzia Bianco, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, based in Berlin. That's where she is right now, where she focuses on political, security, and economic developments in the Arabian Peninsula and Gulf relations with Europe. Dr. Bianco has recently written on the deaths of the mediators-in-chief, referring to the leaders in Oman and Kuwait, and the issue of de-escalation in the Gulf. And directly related to our topic of discussion today, she has recently also covered the issue of Israel-UAE peace deal flipping the regional order in the Middle East. And I'm looking forward to see her description of the flipping that we should anticipate in the Middle East as a result of these agreements. Last but not least, it is Jane Kinninmont, who serves currently as Director of Impact at the European Leadership Network, where her research activities focus essentially on Gulf affairs and European interests. And she has particularly focused in the past on future trends in GCC politics and British and European policies in the region. By the way, congratulations, Jane, on your new position, which she started just a few weeks ago, about a month ago. Jane, who's an award-winning journalist and commentator, has served in recent years as a senior research fellow in Middle East and North African affairs at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, where she did some valuable research on citizenship in the Gulf and on structural challenges faced by the Saudi development plans, including the Vision 2030. So welcome to all of our three special guests, and thank you for agreeing to join us today and help us with this topic. And again, welcome to all of our audience worldwide. And we look forward to a provoking discussion through the presentations and then through the Q&A. Abdullah, the floor is yours, please.
Khalil, thank you very much for this kind introduction and for the invitation to take part with friends and colleagues who I've known for quite a while, and I've enjoyed their relationship. And thank you for the Arab Center for the kind invitation to take part in this very timely and important topic, and that is the peace deal or the Abraham Accord or the normalization between Israel and some of the Gulf states, namely UAE and Bahrain. Obviously, any move towards peace or any activity towards peace is welcome. We live in a region that is plagued by conflicts. And as you know, you look from east of the Middle East to the west of the Middle East, there are conflicts everywhere. And any kind of attempt towards creating peace and normalization is in general welcome. However, I have to say that with some provisos, and that is, of course, it is a bit too much to say that this is actually a peace agreement, and that is, the Abraham Accord between Israel and UAE and Bahrain. As you know, and as of course my panelists and of course all the attendants know, that the Gulf states in general and Israel are not at a state of war. There are, of course, issues with Israel because of its policy towards the Palestinians and towards international agreements that are recognized and accepted by everyone. And the Arab countries in general and the Gulf states in particular have taken a stand against Israel and its activities and its policies in the region, and particularly towards granting the Palestinians their own right, their bid for statehood, and to having their capital, Jerusalem as their East Jerusalem as their capital, etc. So there were issues with that in terms of policies, like it happens with any country, but they were not at a state of war. So the word a peace deal, I think, is a misnomer in this case. That is on one hand. On the other hand, I believe that the reasons for this, or let me just continue on that trend, if I may, and that is to say that if there was going to be a peace deal, or if there's going to be an agreement, the main issue and the main people who are suffering have been totally ignored. The whole idea is to have peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, because they are the two people in conflict. There is an occupying power, and there are occupied people, and who are bidding for their own sovereignty, for their own statehood, for their own rights. And this is recognized by international accords, as it were. If this was really a peace deal with Israel, it would have taken into consideration the demands of the Palestinians. It would have been coordinated with the Palestinian leadership to ensure that the peace is actually between Israel and the Palestinians, where the Arab countries, all of them, not only the Gulf states, have since 2002 have accepted this. And that is the Arab peace deal. The Arab peace deal basically says there's going to be normalization, there's going to be an acceptance of Israel, and there's going to be normal relationship, etc. If Israel was to accept a two-state solution and accept giving the Palestinians their right and their capital, and allow for Palestinian refugees to come back. Obviously, things have changed since 2002, and there is reality on the ground, and those things will have to be taken into accord within any kind of agreement that is going to be signed between the Palestinians and the Israelis. However, the main principles is to have a two-state solution, which is accepted internationally. And the Palestinians have accepted this, the Arabs have accepted this, the international community have accepted this and pushed for it. Israel has refused it. And this peace deal does not tackle this issue at all. It is very much a normalization between these two countries, or some of the Gulf countries, and Israel. And to call it a peace deal, I think it's a misnomer. Now, the question is, why was this done? I think we have to also come back to the fact that and realization that the relationship between Israel and the Arab countries in general, or some of them at least, and some of the Gulf states is not new. This relationship goes back, to the 50s and the 60s and so on, and it has accelerated, especially after the Arab Spring, and because of the conflicts in the Gulf and the rivalry between Iran and the neighboring Arab states. This relationship with Israel has been there. It's been under the table. It's not been official, but there has been a lot of cooperation, and especially when it comes to defense and security issues, and even some, technological issues that are being taking place. And it is not new to people listening to this to hear this, because this is quite well known. All the Gulf states, or most of them, let me reiterate that, have had some kind of contacts with Israel and some relationship. So what has this deal done is basically made this unofficial relationship more official. So to call it a peace deal again, it's not really the right word for it. Now, the question arises, why did this happen? And I think this is, of course, a culmination of events that have taken place in the relationship that's been building up, but it also relates to the geostrategic calculations of some of these Gulf states. Obviously, we all know that there are issues in the Gulf. There is rivalry and competition between the Arab side of the Gulf and the Iranian side, the Persian side of the Gulf. There is also rivalry and competition between the Gulf states themselves. Even as members of the GCC, there is a lot of rivalry and competition between them. And of course, there is also, and of course, the current Qatar boycott blockade is a testimony to that. But also, there is a tendency or a bid from some of the Gulf states to have to stretch their powers beyond their boundaries and to be more, if you like, active, not only within the Gulf, but beyond the Gulf, in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, etc. So this relationship helps, in particular, in the United Arab Emirates, which is has a very, very active foreign policy, as we all know. It helps it with its bid for, if you like, some kind of a regional dominance or a regional say. Israel is, of course, as you correctly said, Khalid, in the introduction, I think you were quoting Netanyahu in this case. Israel enjoys a very strong economy. Its economy is advanced, especially in high tech, in medicine, etc. And we have to mention that there has been some cooperation between the UAE and Israel during COVID-19. So there was already, like, relationship was warming up. So and Israel, of course, is advanced in weaponry, technology, security equipment, etc., which are needed in the Gulf. And I think also the Gulf states have now come to a level where they feel comfortable because they have been the governments have been empowered since 2011, since the Arab Spring. There has been like a counter-revolutionary movement, and the Gulf states have empowered their security apparatus to be more in control of the population. So they feel confident that their population are not going to go against them. So there is that comfort zone that they have. And even if they do, and they have the means to quell any kind of uprising or discomfort or discontent, if you like. So there is that, but also we have to also understand that the UAE needed some kind of an insurance policy, whatever happens with the elections in the United States, the forthcoming election. Whether Trump wins another term or Biden comes in, this is going to bode well for the UAE. In particular, because the UAE, its relationship with the democratic government has never been that good in the past. And we should not also forget the elections itself, although foreign policy does not play a very important role in US elections, presidential elections in this case, but they do, Trump needed to show that he can also be successful, having in fact failed in many of his foreign policy adventures, whether it is with North Korea or with Iran, etc. And this is going to make him look good in front of his supporters, that he has actually brought peace to the Middle East. And I think also I should not miss the fact that we should not forget that this rivalry and competition in the Gulf, there is also a need for arms and arms sales to the Gulf, and the UAE needed the famous F-35 deal, that this deal is going to help it in that respect, where Israel is not going to stand against it, although it did initially. So there were some reasons for the UAE to go ahead with this, as I explained, but it is not necessarily a peace deal that is going to do anything in terms of ensuring there is going to be peace in Palestine. It's not going to ensure that Israel is going to live in peace, because you have oppressed people who are going to always claim their rights, and it does not going to stop annexation, although it says that it would. It may, the best thing it could postpone it, but that postponement did not even come through the deal. It's already there because there was some internal Israeli objection to it, and also even Trump's administration was against it. So it is not going to help the Palestinians, who are the main cause for this, if you like, bad relationship between Arab countries and Israel. It's not that the Arab countries or the Gulf states do not accept Israel, they do not accept the policies of Israel that it has been following government after government. And it has not, Israel has not been able to either deliver on the two-state solution, which is accepted, supported by almost every country in the world, and also accepted by and supported by international resolutions. And it's not, it doesn't want to also go to the next step. If it doesn't accept two-state solution, is a one-state solution. It doesn't want this or that. Once it's its cake and eat it. And obviously there are going to be people who are suffering, and that is the Palestinians, millions of them, as we know, in Gaza and the West Bank, and they want their own rights. And if that is not resolved, obviously we're going to have trouble and disagreements and violence. And the Palestinians have got nothing to lose in this case, because their issue, the main issue, the occupation, the annexation of their lands, and their granting of their right is not being given to them. So in this case, I would, argue this is not necessarily a peace deal. It's a public stunt exercise for the elections, and also to gain regional power for the UAE. In terms of Bahrain, and I kept talking about the UAE, in terms of Bahrain, Bahrain is a follower in this case, and it's been nudged to do that by both the UAE and maybe to a certain extent by Saudi Arabia. As you know, these countries actually ensure that Bahrain keeps surviving financially, economically, etc. And they have a lot of say in how to push Bahrain, which Bahrain, of course, has been, in this sense is a follower and not a leader. The leader in this sense is really the United Arab Emirates. And Bahrain has issues with its own people and its own population who stood against this. And I have my friend and colleague here, Jane, who wrote an interesting article for Hertz to do this, and Cinzia as well have both written about the topic. Well, of course, there are talks of many countries that are going to join. We've heard Netanyahu saying there are one or two X and Y, Z country. We've heard Trump administration saying that. And from time to time, we have leaks coming up. And I think if there was going to be any substantial weight to this deal, it would have to be signed with Saudi Arabia, because it is the largest country in the region. And of course, it has weight within the GCC, and it has weight within the Arab world, the Arab League, and it also has weight within the Islamic world, as it were. But also it's one of the G20 countries, so it has an international weight, and Saudi Arabia would be the prize that I think the Netanyahu government want to win. I don't believe Saudi Arabia is going to do so, at least not now. It's been pushing maybe and nudging its own partners to go ahead with this, but I don't think it is at the moment at the stage where it will do so, for the reasons that it's going to be harmful to Saudi Arabia in many ways, and its reputation and its standing within the Arab world, within the Gulf, within the Islamic world, as it were. Kuwait, of course, had always said that, as we know, there is very strong opposition to it and to any normalization. unless, of course, the Arab peace plan is accepted. And I don't think that is going to happen, at least for time being. And this is what we've been hearing from the Kuwaiti government officials. Qatar has also said the same. We have, Qatar also deals with Israel. As you know, there is a relationship between Qatar and Hamas through Israel. And it does help both the Palestinians and the Israelis to keep peace in Gaza, which is, of course, totally controlled. It's a big prison for the Palestinians. And Qatar is making their life easier so that to stop any recommemoration against Israel. And it's supported by Israel in this sense. So we are left with Oman, and there, as you know, Oman has always supported peace deals. Whether it was the Egyptian peace plan in the late 1970s, whether it was the Jordanian-Israeli peace plan, 94. Oman is invited after Oslo, of course, supported Oslo, but also invited two prime ministers to visit Oman and try to, to see if they can do some mediation between them and the Palestinians. And Oman is also supported the UAE and Bahrain's move in this sense, officially. And of course, there are talks that Oman may be the next one. In my opinion, it's difficult to tell. And I'm sure many people want to ask this question, but it's very difficult to tell what the government would decide. But in my opinion, we have a new ruler, we have a new sultan who's just, started his rulership just recently. And the country is suffering economically, financially, as people would know. And there are a lot of people unemployed. And of course, there is public resentment against the deal. So I don't think the government would want to take a risk to sign a peace deal that does not guarantee the Palestinians their right. At least some of the statements that came from the government says that, we support the Arab peace plan. And we support anything that will guarantee that Palestinians get their rights, their statehood, etc. However, I have always been proven wrong in predicting what governments would do, and it's difficult to tell because they have their own rationale for making decisions. So I don't know whether Oman would be the next one, but my reading is that probably not. They would support it, but they will not go as far as signing the peace deal. And if you like, I will stop here and happy to take questions later on. Thank you very much, Khalil.
Thank you, Abdullah. Appreciate it. The microphone now goes to Cinzia. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to the Arab Center and for putting together such an interesting panel. And thank you so much to Professor Baabood for those opening comments, which covered very comprehensively, I think, the rationale for the normalization deals, especially from the UAE's point of view, but also, of course, providing a bird eye overview of the entire GCC. Let me start by saying that I second all that I've heard from Professor Baabood, starting from the fact that I also think the peace deal is a bit of a misnomer because as he eloquently explained, there wasn't an open conflict really to be tackled with peace agreements. These were normalization deals and the establishment of official relations where there were many unofficial relations going on for a long time, as we've heard. I think that probably given that, the comprehensiveness of the overview given by Abdullah, I think that where I can be of help is to focus on one specific aspect of the normalization deals, which is their reception in Europe. Let me start by saying that it was there were different opinions. There was a large part of the policymaking establishment which really cheered on these deals. And I have to say that in terms of bolstering their own posture on the international political scene, the UAE definitely, if you judge by the reception in some European capitals, made the right call in terms of reaping potentially the benefits of an emboldened position in a number of European capitals. As you would know, there is a certain there is a different sensitivity towards Israel than there is in the US, but quite strong one in many European capitals. However, at the same time, Europe is also been known throughout the years for standing up for the Palestinian cause as well. And there are other European governments and European institutions that have particularly at heart the Palestinian questions. And so we've also heard reactions on these deals, highlighting really how these were not helpful in terms of advancing the comprehensive peace, really, between that peace, in that case, it's the appropriate term, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The European Union, as such, remains committed to the two-state solutions with particular vigor, and they will be, so they will sort of place themselves more towards being reluctant to sort of openly and unquestionably endorsing these deals. What is sort of, I guess, missing a little bit from the policy debate in Europe as I see it is the geopolitical dimension of these normalization deals and how they flip the regional order, as we said in the article. It's clear that there is, on top of everything that Professor Baabood described, there are long-term plans from an Emirati perspective, but maybe also from in other Gulf capitals, to really build on this relationship, to change or tweak some of the alignments that have been built around the fault lines in the Middle East. We all know that the Arab Spring has basically ushered in an era of fault lines, a vacuum of power with perceived retrenchment from the United States, perceived hesitation from other global powers, including the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, to commit to the region in a comprehensive 360 degrees way, rather than just coming in after narrow interests. And this vacuum of powers have triggered a power race, I would say, between regional powers that have taken the opportunity where possible to align in competing axes. And we all know that one prominent rivalry is between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Another prominent rivalry, however, is that between the United Arab Emirates, with support from Saudi Arabia, and Turkey and Qatar on the other side. Of course, the crisis between the GCC has made that very clear. But what is going on, I think, is that after COVID-19, this fault line in particular has been deepened. The Emiratis seem to have made the calculation that Iran is weakened by COVID-19 and by the maximum pressure campaign in a way that makes them a little bit less threatening on the regional scenario. And for example, a little bit less capable to provide the assistance, the engagement, the support to their own, call them as you may, proxies or clients or allies in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so on and so forth. And I think this calculation is what has driven the UAE's outreach to some of these Iran-allied players in the wider region, basically arguing that the UAE is able and capable to provide a differentiation or provide options to these players if Iran has to step back and focus a little bit more inward towards tackling the pandemic and the steep financial crisis. On the contrary, the other front, the one against Turkey, has become hotter. And nowhere is this clearer than in the Mediterranean and Eastern Mediterranean in particular. We have seen in Libya a Turkish campaign that successfully put General Haftar, who is backed by the UAE, back towards his own center in the east of the country. And then we have seen Turkey taking much stronger position, more controversial, confrontational positions vis-a-vis Eastern Mediterranean questions that are both related to gas and energy in general, but also to questions of maritime borders and more openly political differences between Turkey, Greece, Cyprus. And in all of that, Israel's position is quite unique. Because on one hand, Israel and Turkey have quite a difficult relationship that goes through a lot of ups and downs. On the other hand, Israel has been reluctant to join on full force what we could call the strongest, the powers that are most committed to containing Turkey. In all of that context, then, if we factor in the UAE's outreach to Israel, which of course happened for all of the reasons that Abdullah described, we can then also add another perspective, which is, wouldn't it be in Emirati interest to be able to cultivate better relations with Israel and then sway their position more decisively against Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean questions? And if we assume that it would be in their interest, it then becomes clearer how important the Mediterranean, the entire Mediterranean, has become for the UAE and will probably remain a priority in 2021 and 2022 and in the near term in general. Why do we, the reason why, the Mediterranean has become, I think, increasingly a priority for the UAE is that, of course, there are questions of geopolitics and they feed into the fault lines that we described earlier and the desire to extend sheer influence. But there are also questions that have become more interesting because they are, I think, a little bit newer in the sense that there is a lot of geopolitics of infrastructure going on from what we can see. A lot of side deals are starting to emerge parallel to the main normalization deal with Israel, which are very commercial and apparently quite politically neutral on the surface, but in fact, redraw the geopolitical map through infrastructures. I'll give you a few examples. The first one is the very recent news that Israel and the UAE are thinking about cooperating on a pipeline that would bring Emirati energy directly to the Mediterranean. If that were to become true, and of course we're talking about very long-term developments, but if that were to be true, then you would add a phenomenal element to the energy balance in the Mediterranean and therefore potentially in Europe, putting into question everything that we already know about the complex web of energy and the geopolitics of energy that is playing out at the moment. A second example is how DP World, which is the Dubai-owned shipping giant, is in talks to discuss access and use of the Haifa port in Israel. And the Haifa port in Israel is a very important port, not only because of how strategically it is located at the heart of the Eastern Mediterranean, and it is one of the few really large and very well developed infrastructure, port infrastructure in that particular quarter of the Mediterranean, equipped with the latest infrastructural facilities, but also because it's a very important nexus for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And there's a lot of controversies going on there because of the US strong opposition to any opportunity that China could use the Haifa port in Israel for its Belt and Road Initiative. Therefore, a lot of question marks whether that would actually happen. But we can safely say that the US would not have the same degree of hostility if it were DP World to use the Haifa port. And what does that mean? It means adding a very important, if you will, crossroads to an already quite ambitious and extensive network of ports and maritime infrastructures in what, if you look at the map, looks increasingly not simply a commercial strategy, but also a strategy with a lot of potential in terms of geopolitical penetration. And I will just briefly mention here that the UAE is the single most important, the DP World is the single most important player in the maritime domain in the Horn of Africa. And we all know how a lot of potential there is in the Horn of Africa, both from a geopolitical and economic point of view. And finally, as still staying on this point of infrastructures and geopolitics, we shouldn't forget two more domains. The first one is cyber, and there is increasingly the drawing of cyber networks and cyber infrastructures, if you will, in thinking about ways to connect Europe and Asia, and how the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East could play a formidable role. Only right now, at this very time, there are at least 3 mega projects that are being discussed in terms of underwater cables carrying data. One of them is done directly by Google, and it would be, that's the Blue Raman project, and that would be the first underwater cable with incredible capacity, data traveling much more quickly and in a much less expensive fashion, that would bypass Egypt, for example, and connect directly Europe to India via the Arabian Peninsula, of course, passing through Israel. And finally, railways, because if we look at the ports and everything that we said about the potential for further expanding ports capacity, then if we factor in the project that is strongly supported in Israel to build a railway connecting Israel directly with the Arabian Peninsula and the UAE, that would not only further speed up any trade exchanges between the Arabian Peninsula and the Mediterranean, but also potentially bypass the Strait of Hormuz and the Arabian Sea and the Bab al-Mandab and the Suez Canal, because at this moment, if you go, via maritime routes, you have to circumvent the whole peninsula and then navigate through what can be risky waters offshore the Horn of Africa. So in all of that, I will close by saying that this dimension, I think, still remains underexplored. And in particular, the fact that all of these infrastructural projects with all of this geopolitical baggage, if you allow me to use this sentence, converge in the Mediterranean. And unfortunately, it is not yet very extremely clear that there is therefore a lot of potential destabilizing ripple effects to what is going on if all of these processes are not channeled and tweaked and basically carried on together by taking into account possible consequences. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cinzia. Clearly, I guess the Mediterranean is going to see a lot more competition over the next few years, economically, politically, security-wise, and so on. Jane, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's been fascinating so far. I'm going to talk a little more about what these agreements mean in terms of the core conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians. And I want to start by saying a little about the slightly different motivations on the side of the Gulf states versus the Israeli side for reaching these agreements. I think we have to bear in mind that this process of establishing relations has been quite a long-term one. And there are many precursors, you know, at the time of the Oslo Accord, several Gulf states established offices in Israel and vice versa. But really over the past decades, you know, since the insecurities generated by the Arab uprisings of 2011, we've seen Gulf countries and Israel increase their informal communications and really develop some sense of shared regional threats and shared regional interests. I think part of it, from the point of view of some in the Gulf, is simply generational change, that the conflict looks different if you witnessed the very beginning of the conflict and the Nakba and the creation of the state of Israel versus a younger generation that has grown up with, you know, the major violence in the region being in Syria and in Iraq, and not so much associated with this conflict. It's not purely a generational thing because we see quite different stances among the Gulf states. But, you know, it's interesting if you look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, there seems to be quite a different conception of where Saudi Arabia's interests lie between the Crown Prince and his father, you know, partly on generational lines. I think for the UAE in particular, you know, they are fascinated by what makes a successful small state, and leaving all geopolitics and identities aside, they see Israel as a successful small state that they would like to understand better and learn from. You know, all this has kind of intensified over the past decade because Israel and the more hawkish Gulf states have found themselves basically advocating for some of the same things in Washington, D.C. So, for example, UAE and Israel were both heavily lobbying the US to stick with the military regime in Egypt after the 2011 uprising. They found themselves also taking quite similar positions about the JCPOA with Iran. And a lot of their sense of common interests and shared threats is about having a shared view of where the US should sit in the region. But that looks a bit different from the Gulf than it does for Israel, because the Gulf states are anxious that the US will abandon them in a way that the Israeli state doesn't feel itself so deeply. And, you know, I think what has happened for the Gulf countries over time is that in the past, they used the promise of normalization and economic opportunities as a carrot for peace, in the hope that they could resolve the Palestinian issue. And more recently, the priorities have flipped. It's been the cooperation that they've wanted, and trying to pursue some kind of peace has been the means to get there. And as time has gone on and there's been so little progress, they've essentially begun to wish that the Palestinian issue would go away. And what you've seen with these normalizations is really a sense that they can bypass the Palestinians. The UAE timed this cleverly by arguing basically that they had persuaded Israel to suspend annexation in return for the peace agreement. Now, it does seem, from talking to Israeli analysts, that Netanyahu had already taken that decision in part because of internal calculations and also because of quite extensive international pressure, including from Europeans. But the UAE certainly gave him a very graceful ladder to climb down, and face saving is always important when people want to back out of their entrenched positions. Because these peace agreements have been so popular, he was able to say to the more right wing within Israel that this was much more important than annexation, which only a minority of Israelis really buy into and care about. However, it became quickly quite apparent from the comments from Palestinian officials that the UAE didn't coordinate this really or consult much with Palestinians to make this agreement. And then when Bahrain followed suit, there was actually nothing at all in the messaging around the agreements to suggest that Bahrain had got even a symbolic step towards the Palestinians, not even something on the health or humanitarian side at the time of this pandemic. Quite astonishing. So there has been, I think, a sense that the Gulf countries have bypassed the Palestinians, but still it would be better for them if there was progress with the Palestinians, because clearly UAE and Bahrain are less worried about public opinion than many other Arab states. You can see that Saudi Arabia and Sudan are both under pressure to follow suit and are making much more complex calculations about public opinion. For Saudi Arabia, its concern is probably about Islamic public opinion writ large. For Sudan, it's much more domestic, given its fragility. But the UAE and Bahrain, as Abdullah has pointed out, they are countries that are sort of not following public opinion, and over Bahrain's last decades, they have quite systematically repressed the political movements and civil society that have mounted opposition in the past. So they perhaps feel they have less to fear. But you can see that some problems could arise for them in future, if the conflict with the Palestinians heat up. Maybe it's a matter of when rather than if there's fresh fighting in Gaza. There are many ways, in which the Gulf countries could become embarrassed by their close relations with Israel. Conversely, for the Israeli government that's currently in place, this isn't just a case of bypassing the Palestinians. It is quite explicitly a way to sideline the Palestinian cause. And the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has repeatedly said that the agreements basically confirm his belief that he doesn't need to make peace with the Palestinians in order to make peace with the Arab and Islamic worlds. Of course, we have to remember the UAE and Bahrain are tiny states. They don't exactly represent the entirety of the Arab and Islamic worlds. But this is a narrative being marketed very heavily within Israel, and it's quite concerning. It's the sense that there's a zero-sum game between different pieces of peace, and that if you've got this one with the Gulf, you don't need the other one with the Palestinians. I think it's this viewpoint that Europe and all of the Gulf states have a common interest in questioning and countering, because ultimately, the problems of regional security and the security problems that Israel itself faces are, of course, deeply related to this conflict and occupation, of the Palestinians. And it may well be that there will be changes in leadership in both the US and Israel in the coming years that could take quite different attitudes to this. The Palestinians obviously have reacted very angrily, withdrawing their ambassadors from the UAE and Bahrain. And there's been a pretty nasty, not very edifying war of words recently, with Palestinian officials denouncing the UAE and UAE officials saying that Palestinians are ungrateful and disloyal. And I think it would be quite advisable for Palestinian leaders to try to step back from this and try to communicate calmly to the UAE and Bahrain that they do need each other, and that if there is no progress on the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, the UAE and Bahrain will be themselves very vulnerable to criticism and to embarrassment, because they are at the forefront now of the Arab states that have relations with those countries. I think it's so very important that for the analytical community and people who are writing about these issues, there seems to be such a tendency to focus on the mistakes and weaknesses of the Palestinian leaders, almost to the exclusion of the bigger issues. And there's certainly a lot to be said in criticism of the Palestinian leadership, but we mustn't confuse the issues of whether the Palestinian Authority leadership is a good leadership and whether the ongoing occupation is somehow acceptable. The questions of who has failed to be successful in different rounds of negotiations is actually quite separate from the issues of international law, international humanitarian law, the laws of war, etc., which aren't about who wins at the talks, but what is acceptable or what should be acceptable to the international community that has agreed on these common sets of standards. I think we will increasingly, though, see pressure from below for the Palestinian leadership to reset itself or to step back altogether. It is interesting that in principle, the Palestinian factions have agreed to have elections. There may be various technicalities that will enable them to get out of it. But I would argue in terms of policy recommendations that is something that the international community should support, that it is important to have a kind of refresh and a Palestinian leadership that can really demonstrate legitimacy and connection with its people. But bearing in mind that, the people in general are also quite confident that these normalization agreements are not good for them. They're not going to be any more grateful for the policies of the Gulf, but perhaps having some new generation diplomats and new generation interlocutors with the younger leaders of the region could be quite useful to work out how to actually leverage what has happened to create some kind of progress, which is not impossible. I'll wrap up there, but be very happy to take further questions.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, everyone, for your excellent presentations. I think we have a lot of food for thought here, and I'm sure it will generate a very dynamic discussion for the balance of our time today. Again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A format on your Zoom website, or email your question to events@arabcenterdc.org, and I'll be more than glad to pass your questions over to our guests. The first question we have received is from Masoud Malouf, former ambassador of Lebanon to Chile and a retired diplomat. If Joe Biden becomes president, do you expect significant changes in U.S. policy toward Israel and Arab countries? Abdullah, would you like to take a jab at that? What's the Arab expectation should that after November 3rd? Microphone, please. There you go.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. I also enjoyed the presentation of my colleagues, yeah, thank you for that. Well, I think if Joe Biden wins, there are no two presidencies the same. So we're obviously going to see somehow a different policy, a US policy towards the region. Not necessarily drastic, but there are going to be some changes to the current one, and I'll come back to that. I think even if I would dare to say that even if Trump wins, he's not necessarily going to follow the same thing. Again, there are no two terms the same. The second term policy changes from drastically also in some cases from the first term. But if Biden wins, and especially regarding US policy towards Israel, obviously we know what Biden stands for. I mean, he is a supporter of State of Israel, and I think that will continue. But he is not a supporter of the grand deal, as it were, that Trump had initiated, the deal of the century. He's not a supporter of that. He's a supporter of a two-state solution. And I think he would want to push the Israelis to accept a two-state solution. Because in his opinion, in his administration opinion, this is a much better arrangement for the security of Israel than the current situation, where there is no solution, or even a de facto one-state solution. So I think he would want to push for that two-state solution. I think he will push Israel towards that. He supported the Abraham Accord in one sense, but he did actually stress that he is supportive of a two-state solution, and he is the one who basically said we should not ignore the core issue here, which this deal, the normalization deal, has ignored, which is the Palestinians. Without that, you're not going to have peace, and Israel is not going to live in peace. And I think, having in his heart the peace, that Israel should live in peace, there is a pressing need to kind of sort out the Palestinian issue. As far as his other policy towards the region, I think there's going to be a change. I mean, his relationship with Turkey is going to be different from the Trump administration. His relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think, is going to be more critical than the current one. There is going to be issues with Iran. I mean, some people might think, have also, or some pundits have also gone as far as maybe signing another JCPOA as well. That is maybe slightly different from the existing one, but he's much more tuned towards negotiations with Iran rather than following the current US Trump administration policy of maximum pressure. And that's not going to go well, of course, with the other Gulf states. So I think his relationship with some of the Gulf states, at least the ones that are now supportive of the Trump administration policy towards Iran, is not going to be the same. He's going to be more critical of some of their policies, especially the war in Yemen, relationship with Iran, etc. And I think he will be, in a sense, different from the Trump administration, that wants to see that the region actually lives in peace and lives in peace with itself, and not just trying to sell arms and dictate terms to the region. I think he would want to bring peace to the region, and he wants to see that there is going to be some kind of reconciliation, not only with the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also with the Iranians and the other Gulf states. So from that respect, and he'll be more critical, of, as I said, of Saudi Arabia and maybe some of the Gulf states and their war in Yemen and other issues related to that. So I think he's going to be different in that sense.
Thank you, Abdullah. Same question in a way. I'd like to kind of tweak it a little bit and address it to Cinzia. And you express the sensitivities and concerns on the part of the Europeans in terms of what these deals are implying or excluding. Would the change after on November 3rd ease some of these concerns on the part of the Europeans and make it more feasible maybe to pursue more conventional attempts at peacemaking in the Middle East that are more to the liking of European allies?
Yeah, that's certainly what the Europeans would expect from Biden. So they all expect that if Biden wins, there will be an attempt to build on this normalization deal to convey a regional sort of conference or a regional effort to discuss then the core question, which is the Israeli-Palestinian question. And so that's, you know, the expectation that rather than pursuing other bilateral deals, Biden would try to pierce them together in a wider regional framework that brings back again at the center the core question of Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Jane, in your remarks, again related to this question, in your remarks you did address the performance or lack thereof on the part of the Palestinian Authority and the challenge that the Palestinian leadership is facing in responding to this new trend in the region. Would that change again on November 3rd, possibly create an opening for the Palestinians to climb down, if you will, the tree they find themselves on at this time?
To some extent, I think there could be a willingness from Palestinians to re-engage with the US, especially in a regional framework. The Palestinian president has already called for a conference to be convened by the Middle East Quartet. But I think deep problems of trust would linger, you know, because on this issue, Trump and Biden perhaps aren't as far apart as they are on so many other issues. And I think that, you know, Palestinians feel let down by successive US presidents. Ultimately, you know, the US is much closer to Israel than it is to the Palestinians. And a core problem that we have at present is there is not a very active political constituency in Israel for a two-state solution. That could change if there were political leaders really pushing it. I mean, we've seen over the years many surveys that have suggested that Israelis would be willing to make various compromises if they believed that it would bring them peace. But it seems that the mainstream belief in Israel now is that land for peace doesn't work. You know, people have generally interpreted the Gaza withdrawal as showing that they have felt we left Gaza and we got Hamas. Now, obviously, that's quite simplistic, and Gaza remains legally under occupation, its borders under Israeli control, etc. But the way that that's been perceived has really damaged the peace camp. And again, I think these normalization agreements play into that trend, makes it easier for Israelis to think the two-state solution wouldn't bring us peace and we don't need it. And in recent rounds of Israeli elections, they've obviously had 3 quite recently, hardly anyone has talked about the two-state solution, hardly anyone has stood up for it. Israelis who are really pro-peace, some of them are voting for the Arab Joint List because they don't see mainstream Jewish Israeli parties actually calling for an end to the occupation at present. So this is a real problem. And I've noticed that in my previous job with the elders, we had a number of virtual dialogues over recent months convened with the Carter Center, where we spoke to Israeli and to Palestinian civil society groups. And we can see that internationally, Europe especially is still absolutely committed to the two-state solution. And when you talk to activists on the ground about the two-state solution, they are puzzled, frustrated, embarrassed. They say, what are you talking about? This phrase doesn't even exist over here. So there is this big disjunction between what the pro-peace elements in the international community are pushing for and what the people on the ground have in their minds. And on the Palestinian side, similarly, people don't believe that the two-state solution is actually going to come. They're divided over whether they want it, but generally, they just don't think that it's going to happen. And what incentives could be put in place to actually change those beliefs on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side? And would any US administration really be willing to take that on? I think these are still very tough questions.
The next question comes from Gregory F. Tandilian, non-resident fellow at Arab Center here in Washington. Although Biden, I will address that to Abdullah, although Biden has welcomed the normalization agreements, he may try, if he wins the presidency, to push for a genuine Palestinian-Israeli peace deal, and all three of you have referred to that. If that should be the case, will other Arab states kind of hold back a bit on normalization to see what develops in these attempts, or would that escalate the normalization trend that we see at this time?
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Gregory. I think there is, I don't think we should jump into conclusion that there are going to be, the Arab states are going to line up to sign the normalization deal that it's just been signed between Israel and UAE and Bahrain. Obviously, for lots of reasons, there are, there are comments saying that there are Arab countries that are going to do that, and there is a common list, as it were, of among Arab countries that says that they're going to follow the trend of both UAE and Bahrain. However, we haven't seen anything that has happened since then, and I think between now and November the 3rd, we might see a lot of pressure building up from the US administration. I believe maybe Secretary Pompeo has visiting the region soon to talk about that and to push some of the other Gulf states to follow suit. And as I said, Sudan is another country that they are trying to push. And we've heard that there are some issues happening there, maybe leading or preparing the ground for it. However, I don't think there is, I don't think the Arab countries are currently they don't have the stomach for it. They don't see it that this is going to solve the situation. As much as they want peace and they want to deal with Israel and they want to cooperate with Israel, but they see that this is not going to solve the problem. Now, if Biden comes and he calls for a presidency, the question is very pertinent in that sense. Would the Arab countries go for the normalization, or will they await to see that there is a solution to the Palestinian problem? Let us not forget when we are talking about this that the Arab countries' position vis-a-vis Israel is not necessarily because they hate Jews or they hate Israel or that source that that some people try to sell us the idea. Their position towards Israel because of the plight of the Palestinians, and if that was to be resolved, they have already said since 2002 that they are ready to normalize relationship, and it would have been better for Israel to do so with the Arab world collectively rather than individually. And it will also be better for the Arab countries, and it will give them, if you like, the reason to have that kind of relationship with Israel and normalize if there was a solution to the Palestinian problem. So the core is...
If I might interrupt there just for a minute, Abdullah, we have a related question to what you just stated from Aziz Al-Ghashan in the UK. What is the status today of the Arab Peace Initiative? I mean, is it still alive or not in the context of what's taking place?
Well, no one is talking about it anymore. And as no one is talking about the two-state solution in general. Obviously, there seems to be an attempt to overcome all of this and to ignore that there is a problem and to force the Palestinians to accept whatever is offered to them. Unfortunately, in this case, there is nothing that's been offered to the Palestinians that is meaningful. And I don't think there is any Palestinian leadership that's going to agree to any deal just because, that's the only one on the table. It has to be a meaningful deal that ensures that they have their own state and guarantees their bid for statehood and nationhood, and also to respect international laws and international resolution. Things have changed since the Arab deal, and I think even the Arab peace plan, and I think even that doesn't. I think the principles of the Arab peace plan should be there, and I think this is what Biden should stick to, and to say that there are two-state solutions, a Palestinian state living in peace with Israel, and of course, all the other details that we've mentioned before. I think without that, basically, we are skirting around the main cause, and trying to push the Palestinians to agree to something that it's difficult for them to push. And basically, you're not giving them anything on the table that is worth taking.
Okay, related to that, Jane, we have a question from Johan Shar from Cypri, Stockholm. Reports from the ongoing visit of Emirati diplomats to Israel indicate that there seems to be some doubling down on normalization, the visa waiver, if you will, exchange, investments focus, but it's translating itself into upgrading checkpoints on the West Bank, highly provocative steps toward the Palestinians, rather than meeting the expectations of some that the UAE would actually leverage, like all three of you indicated in your statements before, that would leverage normalization to ease occupation. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, I mean, I think that Palestinians have not been very surprised by this. I think the immediate concern among Palestinians was that the normalization and security cooperation would not be in their interests. I think it is still possible that the normalization could be leveraged in a more pro-peace way. But I think that would involve quite intensive diplomacy with the UAE to encourage the UAE to recognize that it is also very vulnerable to quite severe reputational damage over this. And it is a country that does care about its reputation. I think this very bitter war of words between the UAE and the Palestinian Authority leadership at the moment isn't helping. And the UAE would do well to think about broader public opinion among the Palestinians and more broadly in the Arab and Islamic world, and not allow this to become too much of a personal enmity with the PA leadership.
Thank you. The next question I would like to address to Cinzia. We have several people in the audience that have raised the issue of public opinion, particularly within countries that have already kind of jumped on this normalization bandwagon. Omar Masri, for example, Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab, our colleague from the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, and so on, raised this issue. Are we going to see this widening gap, Cinzia, between public opinion and public policy in this country? Is there really a genuine rising opposition to this normalization, particularly when you take into consideration, and I hope you don't mind me plugging our Arab Opinion Index at this point, the most recent index that we did for this year, showing again countries like Algeria with 99% opposition to diplomatic recognition of Israel. Even Saudi Arabia, which is the lowest, stands at 65%, and other countries in between. I mean, the average, the aggregate is 88%. If 88% of Arabs tend to be opposed to that, where are these governments getting legitimacy, if you will, or courage to proceed forward, knowing where their public opinion is? Cinzia?
I mean, this is a very relevant question, and I think you did a very good job with the Arab Index. and I have had the opportunity to look at it in details, and I was indeed surprised by the fact that Saudi Arabia appears to be the country where the sort of support for normalization is the biggest at the moment in the ones that you have surveyed. Although, I mean, still 65% of the respondents say they oppose the deal or a possible deal. That means that leaves 35% who are considering it. And where am I going with this? I think that at the basis of this 35%, there is a certain work that we have seen playing out in the past few years with gradual openings at the level of official statements, with even Ramadan TV series, with social media campaigns. And my point is that, yes, you cannot brainwash public opinion into completely flipping on a subject as big as this, but you can move the edges through operations of public opinion engineering, basically, through different means, if you allow for a certain time and if you operate in a context where there is hyper-nationalism that is being pushed on all levels and on all fronts and on all topics constantly via all media outlets. Having said that, there is this key factor of time and sensitivity that I would argue is at the basis of Saudi Arabia not taking the step of normalizing relation right now, precisely because this is a quite delicate operation, but that can be done. And and that is in opposition to a situation like that of Bahrain, for instance, where although there was public opposition and there were even official statements released by a number of political societies in the Bahraini parliament, including with political Islam sympathies, Shia political Islam sympathies, but also leftists, so very secular political societies, liberals. So it seemed to be sort of very widespread. But the fact of the matter is that Bahrain remains a small country where these oppositions, these sentiments can be controlled and can be kept under the sort of problematic threshold.
Okay, the next question goes to Jane, and essentially it's a combination from like different actually people on the audience have raised that with regards to the issue with Iran. How do you imagine the new administration, regardless of it's Trump or Biden, they both are threatening to come up with a new agreement with Iran, but is that a possibility? And how are the two candidates viewed as different on this issue?
Well, I think for the past 4 years, President Trump has repeatedly said that he wants an agreement with Iran, but the kind of actions and behavior of the US towards Iran haven't indicated any attempts to set the conditions for talks. And certainly there have been various people within the administration who have been more in favor of regime change than anything else. So for me, it's relatively hard to see how a second-term Trump would move more convincingly towards reaching an agreement with Iran. By contrast, obviously, Biden has said that he would like to go back into the JCPOA and then work towards a more comprehensive dialogue and agreement that dealt with issues of Iranian policy in the region and Iranian missiles. So it sounds like you would see very different scenarios under the two presidents. But meanwhile, of course, we have an election in Iran to look forward to as well, and the certainty that Rouhani will be out of office in the middle of 2021. Arguably, Rouhani's political career has been massively undermined by the failure of the JCPOA to deliver what Iran wanted. Largely because of the US withdrawal and the reapplication of US sanctions. And most observers think that Iran will move towards a political leadership that is less inclined to engage with the West. So I think the ambitions of the presidential candidates are only part of the story. And that is a big concern, that even if there's a real drive to return to the deal and to broaden it, the willingness might not be there by now on the other side.
Thank you, Jane. Abdullah, the next question comes from Imad Harb, our colleague who happens to be in Lebanon today, joining us from Beirut. Do you think the UAE normalization with Israel will bring in equal benefits to the different Emirates in the UAE? Is the reaction I mean, are there any evidences to the fact that the reaction in Dubai or Sharjah is the same as it is in Abu Dhabi?
Sorry. Unmute. I need to remember to unmute myself. All right. Thank you, Dr. Imad, for this question. I think it is difficult to tell how do the UAE or the Emirates that are part of this federation, how do their leadership look at this? Because at the moment, what we're seeing is basically Abu Dhabi being the main Emirates, making all the important, if you like, policy decisions and foreign policy decisions. But I just want to say something related to this, and that is, what are the benefits from this normalization? Not only to the UAE, to any country that can think about. Obviously, there are economic benefits, and people are talking about that. And obviously, yeah, there is, as we said earlier, Israel is a highly tech country in the region. It can help in many ways in defense and security, education, healthcare, etc. There is no dispute about that. Also, I think Cinzia mentioned, the different projects that can be useful to the whole region. Although these are quite long term, and it's difficult to tell whether they'll come or not. And they will only be able to mature if there was a comprehensive piece, because it will involve other countries, not just the UAE. Apart from maybe buying equipment and technological know-how, etc., from Israel, and maybe some arms and security apparatus, it's apart from that, which is actually already happening anyway. You don't need a peace deal or a normalization agreement to do that. I don't think there is much apart from these large projects that are also very long-term and to require a more comprehensive deal. So maybe the smallest thing that we can think of is tourism, and maybe cross investments and more open relationship. But even that is happening anyway, directly or indirectly. So I don't see the benefits that not only UAE is getting, but also and other Emirates, but also the region from doing that. It would have been much better if this was a regional-based deal that, of course, deals with the principle of the core cause, which is the Palestinian issue, and there was a peace deal with Israel, and there's regional cooperation that takes into account all the interests of the countries in the region. And there are lots of projects that the countries can do that includes the Palestinians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, all the other countries in the region. Because if you want to link all these ports and pipelines, you need to go through their territories. And it would have been much better to do that rather than having a peace deal that is not necessarily serving the interest of or the benefits of the whole region, but maybe the leadership in certain countries. And I don't think Israel is also interested in siding with Arab countries against the other. I don't think Israel is interested in getting involved in this intractable Arab rivalry and conflict. It's too costly for them. They will reap the benefits, but they're not going to give anything in that front. So basically, I don't think the Arabs are, the point I'm trying to, the Arabs are not against the peace deal with Israel, but it's a peace deal that recognizes the core cause of this problem, and that is the Palestinian issue. If that is to be resolved in one way or the other, that is acceptable to the Palestinians, I think it would be great to have all the countries in the region living in peace and cooperation. And we need a change in the way that things work in the region, because I think we've had enough conflicts. And I think with this new generation, a new outlook, we need a new, a new way of life. And that is to have everybody working together towards peace, prosperity, and security.
Thank you, Abdullah. Jane would like to pass on a related article that she just recently published in Haaretz. You can definitely Google this one, Jane Kinninmont, Haaretz, dealing with this topic, particularly the issue with the difference between Bahrain and the UAE in terms of objectives here. And also she refers to the work done that she referenced earlier with regards to the elders and the work they have done with Palestinian and Israeli NGOs or peace activists. You can find that www.theelders.org, where you can also find that. Again, we're running out of time. Lots and lots of questions are still on my screen here. I apologize to our audience for not being able to cover all and every question we have received. My gratitude to Cinzia, to Jane, and to Abdullah for their invaluable contribution today to help us decipher these very, very complex and difficult issues. Again, thank you for joining us in terms of you in the audience, and we look forward to hosting you again in the future. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye.